Greetings, I'm Judy Samuelson, and I am the Executive Director of a program that is housed within the Aspen Institute called the Business and Society Program. I'm eager to be able to talk to you today about some of the ideas that we've been working on in this program for many years now, and that I think speak to this incredible moment of what you're calling ESG for all, this moment where corporations are both under the microscope and people are trying to find new ways to harness the extraordinary capacities of the modern global corporation to social ends and to environmental benefit. I'm going to take us through some slides and hopefully some of them are provocative, I believe, but we'll see where the conversation leads. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today. This photo you're seeing is actually the home of the Aspen Institute. It's an organization that's about 80 years old, and it began in this valley in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado called the Roaring Fork Valley. And this is a home of the Aspen Institute today, although our program and many other programs operate either in Washington, D.C., or in our case, we're in New York City. The program that I lead, the Business and Society program, is grounded in the belief that the corporation is, by many respects, simply the most important or maybe influential and consequential organization of our day. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. I don't believe corporations are either of these things. I think they are, however, they do embed a narrative and decision rules and incentives, a kind of scaffolding, if you will, for decision making that can have good and bad results. And hopefully we can explore that today, because we definitely need results that are in the long-term interest of society, which provides the license to operate. The power of corporations can be remarkable, and increasingly it's companies that have the talent, the resources, the global reach and distribution systems, and the remarkable problem-solving skills that we need to address complex problems. Clearly, I'm speaking from my experience of working principally in the United States. We work with companies through individuals who work in companies around the world, but a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is, I think, germane to the US corporation and how it has been built and what is rewarded. And here's a thought to explore. True or false? The corporation is the greatest tool we have to assure our collective survival. This is obviously a provocative statement. Many would disagree with it. Some might say maybe begrudgingly it might be the best tool we have. But it begs the question, what is a corporation? And why do we, the public, grant companies the license to operate? And what needs to be true to ensure that these remarkably powerful institutions are working in our collective behalf? This question of the aims and the purpose and the alignment of companies and the intentions and the operations is at the center of our work at the Business and Society program. I'm kind of obsessed with the question of the power of the corporation, but also what are the changes that need to be made to assure that the decisions of companies are aligned with the long-term health of society? And very importantly, how will the change take place? You may be aware of a decision that was made by the Business Roundtable. The Business Roundtable is a US trade association. It represents the largest and most significant brands of US companies. Companies are headquartered in the United States. And just over 2 years ago, the organization earned headlines in the business press really almost globally, I believe, in a moment in which the principles of this organization essentially said, we need to realign our thinking about the purpose of corporations. We need to step into a moment where we understand that corporations are being held to a different standard, and that the stakeholder view, the idea that there are many things that we need to balance in a company, is the one that needs to become our guiding principle. It needs to replace the language around shareholders and shareholder primacy, which has certainly dominated US markets and I would say business school classrooms for many years. This is a complicated undertaking, and it's fair to ask the question about whether or not the intentions of these executives are actually real. Are we seeing a real change in the priorities, or is the share price still the measure of success? This takes me back to a moment a little over 20 years ago when I was still working at the Ford Foundation, and I was preparing to launch this program. And I had the opportunity to spend an hour with Roy Vagelos, who was then he had just retired as being the CEO of Merck. Merck is a 150-year-old drug company. It has its origins in Germany and is a provider of many medical goods and services in the United States and well beyond globally. And this man became Mr. Vagelos became the target of a case study that was produced by Harvard Business School because of a decision that he made involving the production of a drug called Mectistan that was the intellectual property for this drug was assumed that it was going to be worthwhile in treating an ailment connected with heart disease. And instead, they found that it was not effective for that, but it was a cure for a horrific disease that ravages the valleys and river valleys of Africa and beyond, called river blindness. And this drug, Mectistan, was a cure for this horrific disease. So he faced a decision. Should he produce this drug with unmeasurable public health benefits when there would be no revenues to follow? There would be no ability to sell the drug. And in fact, the cost of distribution alone would be significant. He tried initially to give away the intellectual property. He tried to grant it to the United Nations or try to get the White House to help him. And when nothing else seemed possible, he decided to proceed. His decision was ultimately viewed as a public relations coup. And many people would say maybe this was an example of greenwashing. But in the moments that I had with him, he opened up my understanding of what it meant to have a clear purpose for the enterprise and what is involved in realizing that purpose. And I'd like, if I could, to read a brief section of the book and when I write about Mr. Vagelos. The CEO's decision was ultimately a defining moment for a company dedicated to human health. But first, he had to overcome resistance within his own ranks. His executive team rightly feared the slippery slope of engagement in a campaign with no end in sight. It is important to realize that the company is still producing the drug. There are still no revenues associated with it, and he is committed to continue to do so until the river blindness disease is completely eradicated. Yes, they could create some goodwill, but it would be offset by an extended liability. Yet what had truly unlocked the Mectistan decision for Vagelos? We are nothing, he said, without the scientists who are the creative force behind drug discovery. What message would it send to our employees if we decided against manufacturing a drug that cures a disease as devastating as river blindness? You know, it could have turned out differently. But Vagelos was, as the CEO, was first and foremost a scientist. he was crystal clear about what makes Merck tick. He understood the foundation of the company's long-term success, that access to scientific talent was the scarce resource that distinguished the brand and that enabled the company to fulfill its mission to, quote, discover, develop, and provide innovative products and services that save and improve lives around the world. The hour I spent with him is still memorable. It's still seared into my memory as a defining moment in my understanding about what it meant to realize a corporate purpose. I want to compare this with another company that made a lot of headlines in the United States in the last decade. In 2015, Valiant was a hot stock. Like Merck, Valiant was considered a drug company, but it did not engage in drug discovery or create its own intellectual property. The company's revenues came from buying and selling other drug companies, stripping out their costs, aggressively pricing the products on the shelves, even pushing the product through pharmacies that the company itself controlled. The organizing principle was shareholder value maximization. Aggressive stock targets were embedded in the corporation's compensation plans. So where do we take this example? I think that Mr. Vagelos, as CEO of Merck, understood at a level that is critically important what is the real value of a corporation. He understood that it can't be measured on the balance sheet. Today, something like 85 or even more percentage of the valuation of company is actually due to intangibles. It's intangibles that are the real source of value. Intangibles. What are intangibles? They're basically relationships. It's the reputation of the enterprise. It's trust. It's the ability to attract and retain talent. And it's access to critical natural resources. It's these intangibles that underpin business continuity and the license to operate that's granted in the United States by individual states to the companies that are licensed to operate. And this business continuity today, the license to operate, is subject to social changes and myriad forces operating both inside and outside the gate. This slide, in a way, is designed to kind of capture what businesses looked like when I got out of business school in the 1980s. They were largely a function of hard assets. Financial capital was king. Customers, of course, are always important. The material inputs of a supply chain were maybe growing in importance. And then we have what we like to call human capital. Today, when intangibles are the source of real value and trust is at risk, governance itself, which used to be kind of a notion that was barely even taught in business schools, governance has become a very important and critical factor in our sense of whether or not a company is aligned for long-term health. Governance is at the center of ESG. I think you could drop the E and you could drop the S and focus on governance, and you'd be focused on those things that are critical to the long-term health of the enterprise and to the society which grants its license to operate. Customers are still important. The material inputs in supply chain have only gotten more complex, and so-called human capital, the human element, managing and delivering on the promise of our employees, has become a very significant enterprise and concern of governing boards. Ironically, financial capital, even though the noise of capital markets still speaks to the power of financial markets, is not the most critical resource today. We are, as we like to say, awash in capital. We have a lot of capital. It is scarce. It is not the same. It doesn't exist as a scarce resource. And yet a lot of the noise is still focused on the financial markets. So how will change take place? how do we invite a moment when more companies are equipped to think like Roy Vagelos? And I'm not talking about charity here. I'm not talking about the importance of philanthropy, although in some respects it feels like what Merck did was a philanthropic act. What he was doing was investing in the long-term enterprise. He understood that at the center of the question of business purpose, that business has to serve many objectives. But to understand what is really the most important element of the company's success is consistent with putting purpose front and center. So how will the change take place? In the book that I have written, I talk about 6 different elements. We've talked a little bit about rethinking value, the importance of intangibles. And I've talked a bit about the question of business purpose. The businesses serve many objectives beyond shareholder value, but also that purpose is really revealed by the enterprise. It's revealed by the decisions it made. The purpose of Valiant was revealed by how it conducted itself in the market, and the purpose of Merck was revealed by the decisions that Mr. Vagelos took. But the responsibilities today of corporations are not really defined by the company itself. I'd like to come back and talk about that now, and about a few of these other notions that I think are changing the conversation inside companies. Critically, the voice of employee, and when the system itself is at risk. The first one here that I'd like to spend another minute on is the idea that corporate responsibility is no longer defined by the company. When I got out of college, we used to say that companies had 2 major responsibilities: create jobs and pay your taxes. We don't really take either of those for granted today, but nor does the company actually define its own responsibilities. Instead, what we see are myriad examples of enterprises, non-governmental organizations, strong global environmental companies, enterprises that are, nonprofit corporations that work in the field of environment, human rights, labor conditions. They are very willing to harness a brand, like in this example of McDonald's, to be able to get at an issue of concern to them, whether it's the abundance of use of single-use plastics, or today, other questions that McDonald's has front and center, which is the sustainability of its beef supply, or it might be about water conservation, or it could be about human rights or the labor conditions deep in the supply chain. The company may not believe this is actually a domain that it can control, but it's not defining the rules of responsibility. They're being defined by third-party actors who use the brand to other ends, and they become increasingly sophisticated in their ways of doing so. This question of employees, this is a domain that is changing very rapidly in the United States, and I'll be curious to learn if you're seeing elements of this happening as well in Korea. But I think that employees today are the real key to accountability in the corporation. If you think about it, the employees are fully aligned with the company, with its long-term interests. The employees are dependent on the company for their own financial security and for their employment. They want to see the same things the company does. And they are positioned today, in partly the younger employees, but I think it's always been true, but the younger ones are clearly equipped with the art and science of social media and the ability to connect with one another and to identify priorities that sit outside the gate that they relate to as citizens and as members of a community at the same time that they work inside an enterprise. They're working on the inside, but they're seeing these questions that emerge on the outside and are connecting the dots for companies in ways that we simply haven't seen before. Our language in the United States often talks about consumers as being that consumers are holding companies to account, but I actually don't think that that's as true. We see that over and over again that consumers are drawn to price and convenience. And until they're willing to actually pay the real price of a product, they're part of the system that externalizing costs rather than realizing the real value of the enterprise. Employees, on the other hand, are very keen to see that the business model is fully aligned and works in harmony with the natural resources, the availability of natural resources, and the limits to growth, and the human element and the myriad ways in which companies, if not careful, are creating conditions under which either labor forces or communities are suffering rather than flourishing. I think it's also true for investors. Investors come in lots of shapes and sizes, and the ESG conversation is very much about this conversation between companies and investors, but not all investors are aligned with the long-term health of the enterprise. The employees, I believe, are the key today to accountability. And then finally, in a moment in which we're facing existential risks to our collective survival as a planet, we need to look at the opportunities for collaboration and co-creation, not just competition. We're starting to see this in more domains. One of the domains that I write about in the book is the Health of Fisheries. And the example, again, this brings us back to McDonald's, an example where an environmental organization, I think it was Greenpeace, targeted McDonald's for its role in buying from a fishery that was at risk. What happened as a result is that McDonald's then harnessed the capacity of the largest producer from whom they were buying. This was in the Barents Sea in the far north. And that producer was able to amass its entire supply chain in order to develop the protocols that kept that fishery safe. And today it's still operating in a way that is sustainable. We're going to see more examples of this. And of course, this takes us to the question of climate change. We need more leadership in the business sector in the sense of driving policy solutions as well as innovation from within. So this leaves us with this last idea, which is, what is your next impact? How will the change take place from where you sit? I just want to touch on a few ideas here. I think the job of the CEO has changed. We're seeing a lot of change at the top. And newer CEOs that join the company understand that they're actually the manager of a community of interests, a whole ecosystem that drives change within the enterprise, and that needs to be in harmony for the company to succeed over the long haul. It is about building and retaining talent, but also building trust. And then we see the change from crisis, systemic risks that are abundant in the commercial environment, food systems, the health of commodities and minerals, natural resources that are at risk. Partnering with NGOs and the need to drive systemic change in and among industries is very much on the mind of executives today. We're also seeing a lot of innovators from within, internal change agents. I write about the example that we saw earlier last year of employees at Amazon who actually harnessed their own shares of stock to put climate on the ballot at the annual meeting. Did they succeed? No. But did the company respond and change the conversation about the investments that they needed to make and the protocols that they would need to manage within in order to be a contributor rather than operate in an extractive manner? We've got a lot more room to improve here, and there's a long road ahead of us. But these innovators, these change agents within, are increasingly powerful. And then finally, we are seeing change from within industries and business coalitions as well. And with that, I thank you for your time and listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Judy, for your insightful talk, and it was very impressive and insightful. And let me ask you some questions. And my first question is, in South Korea, when explaining the historical background of ESG, it is often said that the Business Roundtable Declaration in 2019 was one of the important milestones. Have US companies really changed since the declaration? So I'm wondering if they have been really keeping their pledges. I'm curious about the current situation and your perspective on the ESG movement in the US.
Yes and no. Maybe we have a long ways to go, I guess would be the short answer. I had the opportunity to visit with Jeff Weiner, who had been the CEO of LinkedIn for a number of years, and sold the company to Microsoft, and then left the company thereafter. And he talks about authentic leadership. And I sent him an email once and said, "What do you mean? What does authentic mean?" And he said, "Keeping your promises." So I think you've framed this exactly right, Professor Chen. I think that this idea that this declaration is nothing but setting intention.
Right.
I believe the setting of intention is a very hard thing to do. And to the extent that companies are clear about their intention, at least is opening up the conversation in a way that's fresh and new and is critically important. So I put a lot of weight on the business roundtables and statement because, in fact, they put a lot of weight on it. They made sure that this was seen in every news cycle, and they took out full page ads in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So they weren't doing this quietly. They were doing it with intention. And that doesn't mean we're there. And what we're still fighting in the United States is that the entire scaffolding of public companies is built around shareholder first thinking.
Right.
So we still see companies that basically 90% of profits are distributed to the shareholder, companies that go to great extents to do lots of different things, avoid taxes, reduced employee costs that, put employees on contracts that are not as healthy for the enterprise, I think, over the long haul, but for certainly for the individuals involved. You see lots of actions happening in the U.S. markets, in the public markets in particular, that are not aligned with these intentions. So we've got a ways to go, and the question is what are the means that hold companies to account? And but without a doubt, public companies face a huge amount of pressure from the public markets, from the financial markets, that do not reward investing in employees, that reduce the stock value when somebody declares that they're going to be paying their employees more, or frankly, just by adding jobs. So these are not rewarded by the stock market, and it's a constant tension. But I believe the real agency is within the enterprise more than in the investor end of the stick. And so, it's up to all of us to continue to raise the bar.
Oh, I totally agree with your point, and then I think you made a very good point. So the direction is right, direction is good, but still there's a way to go. So we may need to look and wait and look whether they are going on the right direction.
Right.
Yes.
Right. That is correct. That is correct. On the other hand, we have many companies that have been at this for a very long period of time. I mean, this is not a new idea to executives that manage these complex global enterprises. Of course, they have to be attuned to what it is that governments want. Of course, they have to pay attention to the supply chain. Of course, they have to listen to their employees. These are not really new ideas. It's about the balancing act here. And so that's where I do come back to this stunning example of Merck. Because of the clarity of what he knew was in the long-term interest of the enterprise. To me, that's extraordinary. And I don't think all companies, the purpose has to be fully aligned, or the business model needs to be fully aligned with the purpose. And that's the part where the tension exists. And so it's not just about, stating something that, makes the company sound good. It's about understanding what is the scarce resource for this enterprise? What is most important to this enterprise's long-term success? And how do we make sure that the business model respects that centrality of whether it is respect for the natural resources or for employees or for a myriad other things? All of these things are important, but the company needs to be very clear about how their business model actually interacts.
Right. So I think, I totally agree with you. And then, so indeed, capital market mechanism is usually not that patient to for a company to pursue their long-term purpose. But I think we need to find a way to balance this kind of long-term perspective and also short-term kind of pressure. So thank you. And my second question is, South Korea is an export-dependent country, as you may know, and in particular, the areas with national competitiveness are manufacturing-based industries, such as steel, shipbuilding, semiconductors, petrochemicals, and automobiles, which have been hit hard by the ESG storm as they emit high carbon emissions. You have been observing the rise and fall of the companies for over 30 years. What advice would you give to these Korean conglomerates in terms of ESG management?
I'm not so sure I wouldn't be giving any advice that they aren't hearing in spades from everyone at this point. So I think there's no dialing back here. I mean, climate change is readily apparent in virtually every news cycle globally. The cause of mass immigration and migration, really just horrific conditions in the U.S. West, in the East, opposite problems, storms versus fire. Nothing that you are not seeing. We're all seeing the same set of circumstances. I think the thing that is also readily apparent is that these companies, sometimes it feels that these companies that are essentially B2B companies are not in the same, they don't face the same kind of direct criticism that we see of, say, these big brands like a McDonald's or a PepsiCo or others. But it's very clear that they are part of the broader system, and that those companies with brands who are under direct pressure from customers and from investors and that sort of thing, they see this as part of the puzzle, and they're bringing their own pressure to bear as well. So we have pressure from governments, we have pressure from their own reading of the crystal ball about what's ahead. And so, I think Korea is probably better equipped than some countries to deal with in the sense that you do still believe in planning your economy for the long term. And so I was recently reading an article just this last week about the degree to which South Korea is investing in batteries and is making that investment realized through purchase of companies that make up the component parts and the minerals that are necessary to compete in that environment. Well, that's an exciting opportunity, and they're doing it because they see that steel is not going to be a growth industry. And so, I believe in the business sector, and I believe that they can see the same things that we all see, and I believe that they're going to need to take change.
Right. So indeed, Korea has kind of 빨리빨리 kind of culture. So 빨리빨리 means fast. So once we think something is good or something is worthwhile, then we change our direction very fast and then we move very fast. So I hope we can also catch up very fast about this ESG movement and then make some good examples for the kind of globe. Yes.
Yeah.
And also you mentioned about the customer pressure and in your lecture, in your speech, you also mentioned about the importance of the employees. And in this, South Korea has another very interesting culture in which younger people do not express their opinions in front of elder people due to the influence of Confucianism. However, recently, employees of the millennials and Generation Z of large corporations are strongly urging the employers to disclose the calculation method after announcing incentives, raising the voice of transparent management and ethical management within the company. So this is very kind of shocking to many old generation in South Korea. So now people begin to see that these young people are quite different from our old generation. So how can companies make ESG management more authentic through collaboration with their employees, especially this young generation?
Well, there's these younger generation, there's safety in numbers, and their ability, they're digital natives and their ability to use technology to both protect and elevate these questions is remarkable. They do face consequences in the United States. The organizers of these campaigns have lost their jobs in cases. But I don't think they're very fully aligned with, they're thinking about the future and they're passionate. And I think this is going to be something that's going to continue to increase. The work that we're doing within the Business and Society program is actually trying to step back and look at governance itself. In the United States, we don't welcome employees onto governing boards. That is not viewed as being good practice necessarily. Although I think some more companies will be experimenting with that model that is a common one in Germany and in Scandinavia. But that doesn't mean there are not many ways to innovate to make sure that we're listening to our employees. I do believe, they are I don't really like the language of stakeholder because I don't think it provides a map for the enterprise about how to manage. I think it's kind of too fuzzy and it's talking about too many things and it doesn't necessarily offer clarity. And employees are not just stakeholders. Employees are the company. They are the interface with the customer. They are the guarantors of quality. They are the ones that understand the conditions in the supply chain. They are the ones that are going to take the criticism, and they care a lot about working for a trustworthy enterprise. So I think employers need to lean into this and understand that the employees are really an asset here. They are not just a cost of doing business, and that they can see things, both risk and opportunity, that are critical to today and to the future of the enterprise. And so whether it's finding new ways of structuring committees on boards so that they are naturally looking at the conditions of employment with a new lens. There are companies that are creating what they call in the United States a mirror board, a board that actually mirrors the makeup of the enterprise from the vantage point of the younger employees, and is actually designed to create better conversation between employees and management. So it's about being creative and, being intentional about it. And as long as if the company can understand the employees and what they bring to the table, I think that there's lots of designs, including how you actually structure the enterprise, its governance, and even its charter, to make sure that employees are an important part of the mix.
Indeed, personally, that statement is my biggest takeaway from your talk today. So you just said employees are not the stakeholder. Employees are the company, they are the asset, and then they are not the cost. So I think that's a very important message to many companies and also business class like me. And one issue, one very traditional kind of the problem that we faced was how to align the interest of the organization and employees. And you mentioned about purpose. So now I think maybe purpose might be one of the important kind of tools to align employees and company. And in your text, in your book, you mentioned Southwest Airlines, Herman Miller, Delta, Microsoft, Salesforce, and Royal Dutch Shell as companies with a sense of purpose. So from the ESG lens, what do you think these companies' strengths in terms of their purpose management and also areas of improvement?
I think they're like Merck. I think they have consistent values over a long period of time. They're not all perfect. But if you think about Southwest Airlines, the founder, the CEO who really grew the enterprise, who died just several years ago, Herb Keller, he understood that employees had to be at the center of the enterprise, that they are, in fact, of course, they're the ones that are going to unlock the experience for the passenger. And people have choices. It's a highly competitive industry. And he understood how important that was, but he's not the only one. And, Costco is another company that as a retailer has operated differently than some of its competitors. Herman Miller is an interesting one because Herman Miller, when they first went into the furniture business back in the 1930s, they understood the importance of design, and they honored the designer. And if you honor the designer, you're honoring that human element, and it has sustained the company and enabled the company to be ahead of the curve on sustainability in design because they were listening to the designer. So I think these examples of companies, I think companies that focus on one objective at the exclusion of the consequences, we see many examples of that. But these are companies that knew what was critically important, but through that knowledge, developed a sensibility about managing across these complex relationships that need to be honored in order for the company to be trustworthy. And so I think there's a lot of stunning examples of companies that have done this. This is not a new idea. It's not just about what we call in the United States B Corps, that tend to be smaller enterprises, so they're not all of them, that start out with the purpose embedded in their mission. It's about leadership, it's about complexity, it's about taking a long-term view. And I think there's a lot of stunning examples to look at.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a very important point. And you just mentioned about B Corp, and then indeed now in Korea, people begin to pay more attention about this B Corp system. So how do you see the B Corp movement? So some people say it's usually more about the small and medium-sized companies. And it may not be easy for big companies to be a B Corp or something like that. So how do you see this movement?
Well, I think it is easier. I think it's easier for companies that have a consumer brand at the center.
Right.
But we can't rely on just that. It's and they're not. I guess I would say this: all companies need to be equipped for the future. All companies need to be thinking about their supply chain. All companies need to be thinking about the relationship with communities, with employees, and the like. So this is not just something that happens in small enterprises. The complexity is real, and that's why we have management. Management, if there's anything, corporations at their heart, the reason for corporations is to accomplish things that you can't accomplish with your own resources or that of your family. That's why corporations exist.
Right.
And they've always been critical for the provision of important goods and services and for infrastructure. And today they're operating under new constraints.
Mm, I see. And then, as you mentioned, I think also big corp, maybe for big companies, they have some pressure from capital market and shareholders, something like that. But still, big corp provides a pretty useful kind of tool or framework for this kind of purpose-driven management. So I think that's still useful to some extent.
Yes.
And regarding that, indeed, in Korea, we have about 3,000 social enterprises in South Korea. And however, it's still difficult for most of them to pursue both social value and financial value at the same time. And you mentioned that a company's vision is very important. How can a small company like social enterprise with such a good vision can grow sustainably?
Well, that's the art of being a for-profit company, you know. I mean, it's just about, I think that those who have advised me from the business sector, who I respect, understand that profits are not the intention. Profits are absolutely critical. You can't survive if you're not profitable. You can't survive for the long term. So it's about what comes first. And of course you need profits, but profits without a clear direction, you know, are not going to take us far enough. So I think it's about a balancing act. And whether you're small or large, this clarity that profits are enabling, but they're not the reason that employees get out of bed in the morning. Everyone we're dependent on the retention of profits in order to grow the enterprise, but it's not what animates people today.
Right. I think that's a very good point. So profits are enabler, but it cannot be a reason. It cannot be an intention. So I think in that way we can see the purpose and profit in more balanced way, I think. Thank you so much for a great point. And if you could say the essence of ESG in one sentence, then what would it be?
I think it's about, well, I said that I think ESG is about the conversation between companies and investors to some degree, but it means a lot of things to different people. And I focus, and we focus mostly on the corporation. And I would say it's certainly about, you said long term. It's like what constitutes a high quality decision that stands the test of time is a way I would try to capture it in one sentence. Because if you take a long-term time frame, that's when the lines start to converge between the short-term interests in sustaining the enterprise and profits and the long-term ability to operate in harmony with the constraints that are being imposed from the outside, whether it's natural resources or labor conditions or the like. So, you know, taking a long-term view, making sure that making a high-quality decision that stands the test of time invites the enterprise to think about who is affected by that decision and therefore needs to be consulted. That could take us back to employees, but it's also what is the condition of a community on which we are reliant to access natural resources or mineral or labor. That's also part of the conversation. So taking a long-term view opens up the lines of communications with those who are most deeply affected by the decision, and reminds us of how critical it is that we're thinking holistically about these decisions.
Wow. So your kind of sentence is about making high quality decisions from holistic view, which stands up the test of the time. So, wow, I think that is very insightful sentence, I think. And I think it also explains a lot. So it talks about the conversation, communication, making relation with many stakeholders and also employees. Yes, and then it has very,
the customer is not going to protect you from the externalities. The
right.
customer is of the moment. Obviously, if you're a manufacturing entity, your customer is one that you're going to have a long-term relationship with if you're successful. But if we're talking about in the B2C world, the customer is there for an instant. That doesn't mean they don't care about these things, but they're not going to be the ones who are guiding the enterprise to think about the externalities of their decision. And so it is incumbent on the company to step back and to map that out in a different way, I believe. And it's complicated, but that's what management's about. They're the ultimate multitaskers. That's what management is equipped to do. And that's why people study management. And that's what we need it to be, helping people think through.
I see. And indeed, as for the customer's side, indeed, I'm a marketing guy. So I did a lot of research and data analysis. And what I observe these days is that indeed customers are beginning to change. And especially young customers in their 20s and 30s, when they make their consumption decision, they usually care about social value and environmental value, which is quite different from older generations. So I think the market pressure will be much bigger in next 10 years and in 20 years. So I think that might be another kind of driver of this kind of ESG thing.
That's interesting. It's an important area for data and for better understanding of that change that you see is taking place over a long term.
Yes. And one interesting thing is that in US, it was maybe if you look at some old papers, which was written 5 years ago, 10 years ago, then you can see that kind of pattern. But recently, now we see that kind of pattern is occurring in Asia, in Korea, in also other countries, especially in developing countries. So I think that's very interesting thing. So somehow young people are synchronized in their way of thinking about this kind of environmental value and social value. I think that's a good signal for companies' future purposes.
Yes, I agree.
Yes. And another question is, do you think that ESG movements create a sustainable future? What are the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders, such as government, corporations, and civil society for this purpose?
They all obviously have a role to play. It takes me back to the business sector, because I think that what we need from business leaders is, first and foremost, to be clear about the choices they're making and the consequences of those decisions, things that are within their control. But what we're finding in the United States is that employees and others are expecting business to also give voice to some very complicated questions that may or may not be within control of the enterprise. And the thoughtfulness with which an executive weighs in on the health of democracy, say, or on some of these social issues can get very, very complicated. But we also need the business community to be stepping in a healthy way with government and to be thinking about the policies that will better equip industry and business leaders to stay the course. And we need a level playing field. And I think in the United States, I find it very problematic that in our system of democracy, we think it's okay to buy influence, and the corporations are compelled to put money into the political, soup, if you will, and try to influence opinion that way, and feel that they maybe are required to do so in order to be listened to. I think that's a system that has very, very big consequences. And it's one that weighs a lot, I think, on business leaders today, as employees themselves have started to say, what are we doing with our money when we enter the political sphere? So government is critically important. We need a government that people trust. And that means reducing this kind of corruption and voice, or business needs to stand on its own and not be influencing governmental decisions in its own short-term interest. It needs to be able to embrace the kind of health of society on which it's fully dependent. I have a sign on my wall that says, I cannot have a successful business in a failed society. We need government to succeed as well. And so, again, back to business, that's a lot of things to manage, but I believe that that's what's ahead of business leaders today.
Right. So I think in that regard, the role of business leaders are very important. And what advice would you give to the leaders who would like to pursue this kind of purpose, but at the same time who are exposed to the pressure of short-term performance from capital market?
Well, I had one business leader that I work closely with used to say, you need to choose your investors. You need to find those who are willing to amplify. They need companies, they need investors who are willing to stand by them over the long haul. One of the complexities of U.S. capital markets is that we have become a society that values index funds to a degree that people are very disassociated from the actual ownership of the stock and its own, are not really part of the rhythm of the system. It's like it's a complex system, and I don't really know what shares of stock are in my portfolio. So we're dependent on intermediaries, and an important share of those intermediaries need to be fully cognizant of the long-term needs and performance of the enterprise. That's what rebalances the system overall. So we're not there. People like to say that long-term is just a bunch of short terms. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but it is part of the dynamic of capital markets, and the pressure on the short term is a real inhibitor to businesses doing what we need for the long haul.
I see. Yes. And another question is about the role of business schools. So this year, Hanyang University launched the first ESG MBA in South Korea, and we believe that education training readers to purpose and think about stakeholders are very important. So in that regard, maybe the role of business schools are very important. So what kind of the talents is important to nurture for the sustainable future, and how can you collaborate with these talented people? So maybe this is, so basically I'm asking you to give some advice to business school professors.
Well, I think the business education system is critically important. In the US, something like 25% of our undergraduate education system is really about business education. Although we put a lot of time and effort in to assure that the kind of liberal arts and humanities are part of that picture, but it's still, the demand is, parents want their offspring to get a job, and they think the best way to do that is to study business. So it is, in fact, a strong base of our undergraduate and our graduate. It's the largest, right next to teaching credentials. Business degrees for graduate students is also a very large domain. So it's an incredibly important part of our education system, and in some respects, it's the education of our citizenry. A high percentage of those who pursue higher degrees are being steeped in business ideas and principles. And so they bring that with them into the public sphere in their own communities and the ways in which they operate in business. So it's critically important, but I find that sometimes universities are slow to move, and that faculty are slow to adopt to the changes. And I just invite us to take advantage of this moment to reflect on what we want the leaders coming out of our universities to be equipped to be able to do. They need to understand the limits of growth.
Right.
In our economy, all of the language and the mantra and the measurement is around growth, but there are limits to growth, and that is abundantly clear to science and to those who study in the social sciences as well. And how do we bring that constraint into the context of business education? We need leaders who can manage to this complex ecosystem that is critical. So that begs the question of departments and the ability to create some cross-fertilization across departments to make sure that we're equipping business leaders with the skill they need to be able to relate to and communicate effectively with all of the inputs to a successful enterprise. And then we get back to this question of relationships and the intangibles. And I encourage finance faculty to get interested in these questions along with their, along with the marketing faculty and those who are teaching more with the sociology of the enterprise in mind. Because clearly the rules that are taught in finance, if we're stuck in this idea that the value of the company is about discounting back the future, and we're not discounting the future. The future cannot be discounted. And that's what we're hearing from our employees today, the younger employees. And so we need to teach to this reality. And we are very keen to find finance scholars who are asking fresh questions today. And we know how important they are in the mix, at least in the US business schools. And I'm going to assume that that's true in Korea as well.
Yes. So indeed, I think finance faculty might be the last one to move. But what I see these days is that many of my finance kind of colleagues, they begin to pay attention to this ESG movement, and then they are really interested. And then I think many of them they're thinking that we need some changes. So I think this is good signal. And one interesting news is that in Korea, we have Korean Business Scholar Association, which has about 5,000 business scholars. And the next year's president to be elect, he's very interested in this ESG and stakeholder kind of capitalism. And the next president to elect, who will begin his tenure in 2023, he's also very interested. So now I think we are going to move very fast toward this kind of stakeholder management and ESG kind of stuff. So I hope. Very good news. Yes. So I hope Korean scholars can make some interesting examples and theories and frameworks so that other countries' scholars can refer to.
Well, that's wonderful. And we have many, we have some resources and that are part of the Business and Society program that I'll make sure I share with you. So
wow,
they can
that's great.
As well.
That's very nice of you. Thank you so much. And so I think we discussed a lot, and then it was really insightful kind of talks, and I'm very thankful. And any final words that that can wrap up today's session?
No, I think we need the talent that you bring, and I only wish I knew much more about your country, and you've given me the opportunity to give a little bit of window in, and I look forward to learning much more and it sounds like you're on the path, as we all are, and we have much more to do, and hopefully we can bring work together in order to make the kind of progress we need to see.
Yes. I'll do my best to visit New York next year, and then Also, we'll try to invite
Good.
you to come to Korea.
I would love that.
Yes.
I
Thank
know
you
a
so
lot of
much.
people that would like to be on that plane with me right now.
Oh, wow. That's great news. Thank you so much. So again, thank you so much for your time and your sharing your experience, wisdom, and your knowledge. So it was very impressive and very helpful. So I'd like to thank you for everything, and I wish the best. So thank you so much.
I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you and your team.
Thank you.